welcome. Thank you for attending this very important discussion on the intervention of domestic violence and public safety. I am Arlene Alpert, Chair of Councilmember Bob Blumenfield's Domestic Violence Community Action Team. Thank you to Councilmember Blumenfield for having the foresight to host this event and for his years of commitment to domestic violence awareness. For those of you who know Councilmember Blumenfield, caring about domestic violence victims and survivors is not new for him. To support survivors of domestic violence, Bob has offered solutions at both the state and local government. As a state assembly member, Bob held a domestic violence summit, bringing together advocates and service providers to help coordinate services and identify gaps in assistance. As an outgrowth of the gathering, Bob created a domestic violence commission to advise him on public policy matters. In 2012, Bob authored AB 2483, which was signed by the governor to help stalking victims get the privacy protections provided by the Safe at-Home program to victims of domestic abuse or sexual assault. After being sworn in as a council member, one of his first city motions was to push city departments to examine city coordination on domestic violence. As a member of the City Budget Committee, Bob helped to creatively bridge the financial gap for domestic violence shelters when federal funding was cut. And he continues to push for full inclusion of DV solutions as part of the city's homelessness strategy. Please help me welcome Councilmember Bob Blumenfield.
Thank you, Arlene, for that warm introduction. But more importantly, thank you for all that you do for our community in so many different ways. She serves on so many different boards. I could go through them, helping the community out in different ways, and then has taken a real active interest in domestic violence and has headed up my community action team, which over the last years, and we started this before I was in the council, when I was in the state assembly, as she mentioned, doing things and creating a summit. And every year I like to do a couple of events related to domestic violence to get out the word and to try to link people together. Because you'd be amazed sometimes how many, sometimes we find groups don't even know the other groups exist that are in the immediate area. So, Arlene, thank you for all of that. Tonight, we're here to learn about ways that we can all make a difference to help save lives. This event today is designed to have a wide range of domestic violence and public safety experts, and the focus is really practical. It's about information, tips, how to safely intervene, how to best assist LAPD by being a better witness. And before I introduce our esteemed panel here, because they are the experts, I just wanted to mention some staggering statistics to kind of set the stage a little bit. Nationally, domestic violence accounts for about 20% of all violent crime. 1 in 5 violent crimes is related to domestic violence. About 50% of all women homicide victims are killed by intimate partners. Up to 57% of all homeless women report that domestic violence was an immediate cause of their homelessness. You think about that. And homelessness is one of the biggest issues we're facing now as a city. And to realize that 57%, the immediate cause was related to domestic violence. 40% of all domestic violence victims become homeless at some point in their lives. And these numbers, they're just numbers, but at the end of the day, they're people, and they're real lives. And that's part of what we're talking about, people who've been hurt, taken advantage of by people who are close to them. So before we can all make a difference, it starts here, finding out about the services that are offered here in the city, learning about how we can help with law enforcement, learning about the signs that someone close to you is in a dangerous situation. So we're going to be talking here Jenny in my office over there is also Facebook Living the panel. Just so you know, we'll not Facebook Live your face if you wanted to ask a personal question. It's more on the panel. And afterwards, if you have something that you want to talk about with any of the experts here, everyone will be available as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the panelists that we have here, and then I will get to it, and each one of them will do a presentation. Maybe we'll do one or two quick questions after the presentation, but really trying to hold most of the questions for the end. When everybody's given their presentations, we can ask more general questions to each of them. But in between the panels, we'll give you a chance if there's a burning question or a follow-up based on something that somebody said. So we have Gail Pincus over there. People, they're not sitting in the order that I'm going to read you their names, so that's to kind of test you to see if you're really paying attention. Yeah, so when I say their name, they'll wave or smile or give you some indication of who I'm talking about. So Gail over there, Director of the Domestic Abuse Center, a nonprofit that works with victims of domestic violence and their children. She is a licensed clinical social worker and an expert witness for domestic violence cases in our court system. She trains LAPD recruits and detectives on the dynamics of domestic violence and worked with the LAPD Van Nuys Division to develop the first DART program. And DART, for those of you who don't know, is the Domestic Abuse Response Team. That's what it stands for. She did that in 1994 to enhance victim safety and improve the law enforcement response to victims of domestic violence. We also have Police Service Representative Rosalia Mendoza. Over here, she's giving you the subtle wave, but you can tell who she is. She is a 911 dispatcher assigned to the Valley Communications Dispatch Center, or the VCDC, in the West Hills. She is currently assigned to the Projects Unit, which maintains all of the incoming 911 audio and computer information for the Communications Division. She has 24 years of total service with LAPD and 15 years as an instructor. Then we have Captain Paul Vernon. You might notice he is the only one wearing a uniform. He is the only one who is a he, so you're probably going to figure out which one he is. He is also a 30-year veteran of the LAPD and the commanding officer at the Topanga Patrol Division. He served as LAPD's public information officer for 3 years and commanded detectives for 9 years. He's held a supervisorial rank or supervisor rank since 1991. He's worked patrol, gangs, narcotics, training, internal affairs. As I mentioned, he's currently the patrol captain at Topanga. Then we have Emily Janes right here. She gave you the right-hand subtle wave. She's been working in the field of domestic violence support and prevention for the past 20 years. She's worked in courthouse advocacy, shelter staffing, hospital response, and group counseling. For the past 2 years, she has been the program coordinator for the City Attorney's new victim support program. And then, the only one I haven't mentioned, so you can use process of elimination, or perhaps she will be kind enough to wave. That's Jill Dupont. She is the outreach manager for Haven Hills. She started volunteering for Haven Hills almost 5 years ago and quickly became a residential counselor before starting her current position 2.5 years ago. She has a master's in art therapy counseling. So we didn't bring any slouches here. These folks all have amazing credentials and experience. I just want to say on behalf of the community and the city, everyone here and everybody watching on Facebook now or in the future, thank you for sharing your time with us and your expertise. So we'll start. We can either go in the order that I read, or we can just go from right to left. Whichever, what would be easier? I'll let the crowd decide.
They have a set order.
What's that? They have a set order. Okay. Oh.
You don't get to attach to your decision.
All right. So, no choices for you. We have a set order, and we are going to start with our very first speaker, who knows who he or she is, and will announce themselves.
The one question I do have is, how do we change the slides when we
You
need
just hit the button. I'll do it for you.
I can be your slide changer, as well as your MC. You just press this button, right?
If I stand over here and do it, and then don't talk in a microphone, I'm pretty loud. I grew up in a boys' boarding school with 250
It also
13-year-old
comes
boys.
off the stand, so you can just carry it with you.
Do I need the mic? Would you? Is it?
Yes, yeah.
I could be your clicker if you like.
I'm much better walking around.
All right. And I will sit down and get out of your way.
Alrighty. So, well, we thought we'd try to sort of line up in a chronological order, so I'm going to sort of divide my time. I'm going to start and then end, and we'll go down the panel. Do you guys want to stand or? Okay. I just can't sit still when I do this. All right. So we thought we would start by just sort of giving you a general overview of what domestic violence is. I think a lot of times when we think about domestic violence or talk about intimate partner abuse, one of the first questions is, why would somebody stay? Why does it happen more than once? And so I think it's important, and I'm just going to do this very briefly. We offer a 40-hour training, which is still not enough time to go into sort of the full, sort of complexity of the issue. But I think it's important to start with sort of two basic takeaways. And the first is that not all abusive relationships are the same. Not all violence is the same. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not a one-time incident. If it was all the same, then everybody could just walk away, because certainly we know some people do. Some people, it happens once and they leave. But for most people, that's not their experience. And so it's important that we understand that it's more complicated than that. And so that often when we see abusive relationships where somebody is not able to leave quickly or easily, it's because there's really a cycle of violence going on. So things start out normally. In fact, normally they start out amazingly. People describe being swept off their feet. It was like dream come true. It's a sort of wonderful love bombing. And over time, it's sort of the tension builds up, the stress builds up, the problems start small, get a little bit bigger, until there's sort of this power over dynamic of walking on eggshells of like, this is all good, but I know one wrong move and it's all going to explode. And then there's that sort of explosion of violence, which may be overt violence at first. It may be just sort of something subtle, somebody slamming something down, someone punching the wall, something that isn't necessarily violence, but feels frightening, but feels scary. Which is then, followed by like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Did I scare you? Did I hurt you? Please forgive me. How do I get going back to normal? And that sort of cycles over and over. And so it's the fear, it's the tension, it's the intimidation, it's the hope. Maybe this is going to get better. It's the, this is amazing again. This is really what our relationship. So we had that bad incident, but this is really what it's like. And so sort of that's a very sort of consolidated, that it's not just a one-time thing, that it's this whole pattern that's going on, and the abusive dynamics are happening at all phases of that relationship, not just when we look at the violence. The other very important part is that violence is just a tiny part of it. So abuse is really based on someone having power and control over the other person. And violence very rarely in the scope of the relationship, if you think of all the different interactions that happen, violence is only a tiny part of that most of the time. It's economic abuse, it's financial sort of manipulation, it's emotional intimidation, it's using the children, it's threats, it's coercion, it's minimizing somebody's experience and belittling them, degrading them, making them feel like it was my fault, like I deserved it, maybe I'm remembering it wrong. So there's sort of this sort of whole thing that goes along with it that oftentimes isn't visible to the outside world, that doesn't break any laws, and so we can't sort of prosecute to stop it, that can't really be seen or masked or even put your finger on it. A lot of times people don't recognize that that's what's happening until they're out of it and have found time and sort of counseling and perspective to look back and say, oh yeah, that's what was happening. But in the middle, it's just sort of confusing. So I just wanted to sort of set an overview of what we're talking about. We're not just talking about someone who loses their temper and punches someone or slaps someone or pushes them into the wall or any of the sort of things that we see the headlines about. So with that, I will now turn it over, I believe.
Oh, it's so quickly.
She's a fast talker.
Yeah.
It's like musical chair. Yeah.
Okay. Whoops. Having followed that, I wanted to provide a little bit of context. Numbers mean nothing without context. So I put some statistics up here just regarding homicides and related to spousal abuse. And very much, I think a lot of what we're talking about here in domestic violence, we frame it in terms of spousal abuse, that is intimate partner related violence. But I want you to understand too that domestic violence goes often way beyond spousal abuse. That it goes within inner family situations. For example, in 2016, we had 9 homicides in Topanga. 3 of those were double homicides, and 2 people were killed in each one of them.
plus another single homicide. That one was a foster son, foster boy, a young man who was fostered by a family. He killed his foster mother. That is domestic violence in many respects. We had another one, two that occurred unrelated, a block from each other, where a young lady was dating a new boyfriend. Her ex-boyfriend came and killed her. Two separate, unrelated incidents that happened twice in the same year, in the same neighborhood. And in both cases, the suspects and the young lady themselves were gang associates. So we really had a gang connection, as well as really, though, motivated through a love triangle. The one homicide that we had last year in Topanga, only one, from 9 down to 1. That year of 9 was very much an aberration. The one we had last year, the wife hired her boyfriend to kill her husband. So now let me give you some larger context for domestic violence, and as you can see, where it goes even beyond the spousal. Again, going back to 2014, 2015, when I was working in Mission, we had a grandson kill his grandmother. We had two separate situations of spousal murders where the husband then committed suicide. So it was a murder-suicide, not pact, but event. So in Los Angeles, over a 10-year period, there have been nearly 3,000 murders. Let me put my shadow over there, right there, 2958. 105 of those out of the 2958, 3.5% over a 10-year period were domestic, where they were spousal abuse. Okay, it was a spouse or intimate partner. By comparison, in that same 10-year period, there were 1,676 gang murders, making up 57% of all the murders were gang versus 3.5% were domestic related. So you can see in the context of that, domestic violence is much smaller number than what happens in the gang, for the gang murders. In Topanga, this area here, West San Fernando Valley, 5 of the 37 murders over the last 10 years, or 14%, were domestic violence versus gang, which were 9 or 24%. So you can see out of that 3.5%, we had a higher number, percentage-wise. But this is the safest area of the city for murders. We have the lowest number of murders over the 10-year period than anyone else. Well, actually, West LA had 26, so we were just a little bit above that. Now, by comparison, the worst part of the city in the southeast area, down south Los Angeles, they had 13 out of 402, 3%. Their gang were 303. 75% of their murders over 10 years were gang-related. By the way, 4 divisions in South LA, Southeast, Southwest, 77th, and Newton Division, they make up about 60%, 65% of all the murders in the city. And they're about 1/5 of the city total. Now, to put this in context as well, let's just look at spousal abuse, which we tie into this, but it's a much smaller number, child abuse as well by parents. In 2017, that actually went up 2% over the prior year to 16,237 incidents of spousal abuse. These can be as simple as slapped in the face, leave no mark, basically what amounts to a simple assault, versus a beating or use of a weapon, which would make it an aggravated assault and a felony. So there are over 16,000 of those. Looking back over the 30-year period, and I'll tell you why I picked that 30-year period, or 10-year period, I'm sorry, there was a 30% increase in those. Does that mean that people are beating their spouses more than today? And the answer is no. That's happening just as much as it ever did, but what's happening is, through this kinds of awareness, people are reporting it more. Let me give you one other bit of context. 30 years ago, when I came on the police department, we didn't have 273.5 of the Penal Code, which says that if a person with an intimate relationship with their partner physically assaults the other person and leaves any kind of a physical mark, that amounts to a felony for which a police officer can arrest that suspect, even though the crime was not committed in their presence. That crime only came up about 28 years ago. And why was that important? Because before that law code change, police officers could not make the arrest. Because what I just described there, a husband slaps a wife in the face and leaves a red mark, that amounted to a misdemeanor. And misdemeanors not committed in a police officer's presence, they can't make an arrest. Only a citizen, private person's arrest can be made. How often do you think wives said, yes, I want him arrested? They didn't. Because he's the breadwinner, because they felt bad now. All that cycle of violence that we've all learned over the last 30 years has changed that. So the legislature, one of the few really good things they did, said, hey, let's change this law to make it easier for police officers to make that arrest and break that cycle of violence. Because sometimes that arrest, just like it is for a drunk driver or for an alcoholic who gets arrested for his DUI, or a husband that abuses his wife over and over, that arrest may be the rock bottom that breaks that breaks the cycle. And that's what we want. That's what we want to do. In that time now, there have been many more interventions then, and people have become much more aware of the cycle of violence. And even through some of my own experience, I can tell you what you described in your cycle of violence and what happens, and the walking on eggshells, and the personality of the person who is the suspect in this case, the aggressor, that also sounds a lot like narcissistic personality disorder. And many of these people and this comes down to a lot of teaching people how to recognize as they meet a partner or a potential partner, how to recognize red flags in people whose personality is not something that you want to be part of. And I have personal experience in that myself. So all of these kinds of things, this kind of awareness, these kinds of interventions, and we have two members of the Clergy Council here from Topanga and West Valley who are part of what we started several years ago. I was in mission, we started doing it as well, doing a truth series, the truth about gangs, the truth about domestic violence, and bringing people into a room like this, presenting clergy members, pastors, priests, and so on, as well as having testimonials. In one case, from a deputy sheriff who came in and she said, I was a victim of domestic violence. And for victims and sometimes suspects who will attend that to hear that, can change people's patterns and help them. So that's something that we advocate doing, and we're going to do in Topanga this year as well, is doing one of those truth series about domestic violence. Okay. Thank you. Next up is, I guess we have to hit the button here. All right, danger assessment. Is that Gail?
I'm relatively unusual in the domestic violence field because I spent over 20 years working with abusers as well as victims. So I heard the story from both perspectives, which is relatively interesting. I have to say that I don't do that anymore because it's exhausting. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how the dangerousness of domestic violence, and that it's really not as much of a mystery as it appears. Because when something happens, when there's a domestic violence homicide, that very often when newspapers interview neighbors, their comments that they'll find are very often, but he was the nicest guy. He was so helpful. He was so charming. I would never have suspected. So it's that kind of outer persona that we very often deal with, and is very effective in keeping victims silent. But through recent research, and there's been a lot of really very interesting and sort of exciting work that has been done, and one of them is strangulation, or choking as most people call it. It's a crime that is lethal, but externally there are very few injuries unless you're trained to recognize them. And this is not only for us in the field, but for law enforcement and for the medical profession as well, that we're really lacking behind where the research is going as to how dangerous this crime is. So not only is it life-threatening and leaves very few external injuries unless you know what to look for, but it also is a predictor on two fronts. One is that if you have been strangled or choked, as most people call it, in your intimate partner relationship, you are 700% more likely to be killed by your abuser. And for law enforcement, the calls in which they are at the greatest danger for themselves being killed is also a strangulation call, or that strangulation has preceded that call. And the recent research is on mass shooters. 54% of the mass killings that have taken place in the United States in the last few years, 54% of them had a history of domestic violence with their intimate partner before the mass shooting. So that tells us a lot. It tells us not only how dangerous for the entire community that domestic violence can be, and why we need to pay so much attention to it, and why we passed all those laws in 1986 to change the law in California, because California has been a pioneer, not only with this former assembly person, but now city council, but we have for a very long time passed some of the most innovative laws in the state of California. We have created, the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office was actually it was the first prosecutorial unit in the country that took domestic violence seriously, and then pushed the DA's office, the District Attorney's Office, very hard to do the same thing. Years later, they did it. They did it with Gil Garcetti. And now there's these specialized units in both the City Attorney's Office and the District Attorney's Office to handle these cases, because it does require specialized training and victim advocates who are here today as well. But one of the things that the research also tells us is one of the most effective ways of dealing with domestic violence are the advocates that do the work. In the state of California, a victim has an absolute right to also have that victim advocate present when law enforcement responds. That's what DART was for. That's why we created it, because a captain was a captain in Van Nuys in 1994 that called community people, domestic violence people, into his station and said, we have got to do something more. We've got to do something different. Too many times the victim returns, too many times the victim recants, too many times we can't find that victim, and these crimes they're overloading us. The cost of domestic violence, each case, is about $140,000. And we're not talking about the personal cost to the victim. We're not talking about the loss of work productivity. We're not talking about the loss to the economy of having that person being productive in the community. We're just talking about what it costs us to prosecute those cases. So it costs us on so many different levels. California just passed another very important law, it's SB 40, and what it now mandates is that law enforcement is supposed to tell a victim about the dangerousness. I won't read the whole paragraph, but I'll read you part of it. And the officer is mandated to tell a victim that I have a duty to warn you that strangulation is serious and can cause internal injuries, brain damage, and or delayed health consequences such as strokes, fibroid issues, miscarriage, and our death. So we're doing it. We're stepping up. We're trying to educate people as well as we possibly can. And you, as the community, as the neighbor, or the one who's got a cousin or an uncle or a friend or whatever, don't be afraid to call 911 on that domestic violence case. Don't be shy, because what we see on the surface is the tip of that iceberg. What you see maybe is the bruise or the little black eye or the scratches, or you hear the hoarse voice of the strangulation victim. Don't be afraid to call 911. You may be saving that person's life. We're going to talk about something new that's happening with LAPD, and it's actually in the state of California about the texting. So that it's a really, really important tool, and those of us in the DV community are thrilled because I said years ago that we in domestic violence should be investing in phone company equipment. Now it's cell phones, because pulling a phone out of the wall is sort of old-fashioned. I don't know even how many people have phones in the wall they can pull out. But that's the first thing the abuser goes for, because the last thing they want is for that victim to call for help. So they smash and break the cell phone, they rip the phones out of the wall if there is that old-fashioned piece of equipment there, to try to stop that victim from being able to reach out. 50% of the calls on domestic violence come from the neighbors, come from the general public, comes from the person seeing that person being yanked out of a car or chased down a street or whatever. It is crucial for you to do that. It is, and that victim thanks you internally. They may never be able to thank you publicly, just as they don't necessarily thank the LAPD officers who also saved their lives. We've got at least one of our DART officers here tonight, so you can talk to her about what it's like to respond to these calls. We've got several advocates. We've also got a couple of Spanish speakers. So I have slides, but they just sort of show you what I've talked about. So I think we're going to the 911 operator.
Hello. I have to advance a couple of slides, one moment.
Can we get those as handouts or print them out online, the slides?
Yes.
Maybe you'll tell us how.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, again, I'm Rosalia Mendoza. I'm a national 911 operator with Los Angeles Police Department. Someone was asking me earlier today, since I work in the Valley, do you just handle the Valley area? No. With the LAPD, we handle the entire city of Los Angeles, which is approximately 4 million in population and 470 square miles. So that's approximately it can be from the Silmar area all the way down up here to the Harbor Division. So as LAPD City, we handle calls throughout the city of LA. The captain was talking about one of the worst parts was the southeast. That's down here, Newton Division, Southwest, and I believe Newton South. But as we call, we handle the entire city of LA. There's approximately 600 operators that work 24/7. 24/7 with LAPD. Another thing we wanted to talk about was statistics. These are 2016. In 2016, we received over 4.5 million calls were received by our operators. 4 million of them. 2.5 were received by our 911 phones when they dial 911, whether it's from your landline or from your cell phone. Additionally, but 30%, unfortunately, 30% required an emergency response. So out of the 4.5, only 30% were actual true 911 calls that we have to ask when we ask questions. And then on domestic type calls, 64,000 throughout the city. So when someone dials 911, we have certain questions we have to ask. And most of them will call from cell phones. And when we ask questions, when we ask questions about the 911, I'll skip this one for a second. When we ask questions, we always want to know what your emergency is, because 911 should be used only for an emergency. But if you're not sure if it's an emergency, we ask you can still dial 911, because us as professional operators, we will ask you certain questions. And then we will move on from there, whether it's not an emergency or not. Again, we have a non-emergency number, but for this case, for domestic violence, we always receive calls from 911. Ms. Pincus said something about text to 911. Has anybody heard about that yet?
No.
text to 911. You can dial from any cell phone that's working cell phone, and some that are not working, you can dial 911. We started it in October of last year, though it wasn't announced till December of last year. But October, guess what our first call was? A domestic violence call. The person, which happened to be female, she was hiding in her closet. And she had dialed 911. She texted 911. And she was able to give us the address she was at. The person was trying to get into the closet with her. And that was our very first call. So now, please spread the word around. You can dial 911 from your cell phone. Text to, call if you can, text if you can't. So you can dial the text. But we're always going to ask you, if you can, after the fact, dial from your cell phone. Does everyone know, does it go straight to LAPD when you dial 911 from your cell phone? No, it doesn't always. Who does it go to? Sometimes. CHP. If depending on the cell sites you're near, those that look like palm trees, sometimes they decorate them like palm trees, your cell phone will ping off of that cell site. So if you're closer to a freeway, it's going to go to CHP. Unfortunately, you have to tell them the story, what's going on, or they're going to ask you where it's occurring, what's going on. And they'll transfer you to LAPD. But be patient with CHP, handles a lot of calls as well, but then they have to transfer them to us. But text if you can't, call if you can. What kind of questions do we ask? First question we ask, well, not one of the ones, depends on what's happening. Where is it occurring at? From a cell phone, we don't get your exact location. That's why it's very important that they give us their location. Sometimes, unfortunately, when we get DV calls, they're yelling the address out because they know their person that's attacking them, whether male or female, will grab the phone away from them. Though that's the first thing, so we have to be very attentive to the calls that we get. We'll ask for the address. Where is it occurring? Where is the person that's doing this? Is he still there? Does he have any weapons? How did he hurt you? Is he doing it now? When? Is it in progress? When did it happen? Has this happened before? And the type of crime, with LAPD, Los Angeles, we as 911 operators, we're the ones that, we create the call. For example, if it's a battery, but it's part of a domestic violence. In 2016, we created 64,000 domestic violence calls that we create. We type code them. Then we send them out to the officers. It may not be an actual domestic violence call. Once the officers get there, they might find a different crime. But just in 2016, in 2017 was approximately the same as well, 70,000. That's throughout the city. Again, and we'll ask you who's calling, who it is. The other day, I just heard a call of unfortunately, a 12-year-old calling because her stepdad was harming her mom. And we as 911 operators, they teach us all the time how to listen to the person and how to get the information. Because most of the time, when that person's dialing 911, they're giving us all the information all in one spiel. She's yelling, she's screaming, he's this, he's that, he's my ex-husband, he's my husband, he's my father, my children, he's at this address, he's done it again, he's a gang member, he's driving this kind of car. They give us a lot of information, so we have to listen very attentively to what they're saying. That's my last. Do you think we can handle any language? Yes. Yes, we can handle it. I'm a Spanish speaker, but we have a language bank. So most of the time when people call, they know, they'll say Russian, or Armenian, and immediately I can contact a language bank to get an interpreter. That interpreter is not going to ask the questions for me. Literally, I'm going to have to tell that operator, ask where that person is at, ask them where it happened at, and then they'll interpret for me. And sometimes I have to be mean to the interpreter because in a different language, a lot of citizens want to give you a story behind it. I need to know what's going on right now. Once the officers get there, they can ask the story. I want to know what's now. So me as a professional, I have to sometimes cut off the person calling, ma'am. And how do I do that? I ask for their name to make it come a little bit more personal, to ask for their name. But that's it on my language bank. Thank you.
So here's where you come in, right? So we've sort of addressed the scope of the problem. The reality is people are reluctant to come to the experts. They don't want to acknowledge this is domestic violence. It's a terribly intimidating name for the problems you're having in a relationship. So oftentimes, especially in the earlier stages, they're going to turn to a friend, a family member, a coworker, a school teacher, somebody sort of in the community. And so it's very important that you sort of have an idea of how to respond. So that's what we're going to sort of spend the next little bit of time talking about. I'll try to not stand in front of this. So when you respond to somebody, it's important to understand that you can be non-judgmental, but not be neutral, right? So to be neutral, okay, well, they hate you, they don't hate you. You want to leave, you want to stay, you want to be safe, you don't want to be safe, expose your children or not. That doesn't feel very good to most of us. No, this is a problem. We need to help you understand that. We need to help you get safe. But you can do that in a non-judgmental way. And so your tone and your compassion and your understanding of this must be really difficult. I can't imagine the choices you're having to make. I can't imagine what is more scary than staying with someone who makes you this scared. So you can sort of convey that as you speak, but you can still take your own actions. So when you're taking action, you do want to consult with the victim and keep in mind victim safety. So some of the speakers talked about sort of the homicides that we've seen, and if you listen carefully, it's the ex coming as often and more often than the current who's doing the killing. So we need to be really aware that when we encourage someone to leave, we may actually be encouraging them to go into a period of more danger rather than safety initially. Ultimately, there's safety out there, but you want to do that smartly. You want to do that wisely rather than quickly. You may also take action the victim doesn't agree with. That's okay. It's okay for somebody to be mad at you in the short term and then thankful in the long term. So let's talk about sort of what that looks like. So when we create change, I want you to think of a person riding an elephant down a path. And you need 3 components to make change. This model can be applied to domestic violence. It actually comes from places like getting people to eat healthy food or to, nurse their children, or just sort of a lot of public health things that we've learned. So the rider is sort of the information. What's the change you want to make? How do I want to get safe? Is this a healthy environment for my children? Should I call the police? Where can I go if I need to leave? Who do I talk to? Is this really domestic violence? Is it going to get better? Is this, somebody who cares about me just being overprotective? Like, you need to sort of understand that. So learn about domestic violence. Take a class, read a book, read credible books. There's a lot out there that are not so good. So, contact hotlines, learn the resources, learn who the experts are that you could sort of refer somebody to. The elephant is the emotional part. Somebody has to feel motivated to move. They have to feel safe to reach out to talk to somebody. But the final part is the path, because if you know where you want to take this elephant and there's a tree over the road, or the road splits and you don't know how to go, you're not really going to get to your destination. So again, what that might mean for a domestic violence victim and for your role in helping them is that you are helping them break down a huge process of interacting with some of these systems that are designed to help them, of leaving a relationship, of negotiating custody, of sort of all of the various parts. How do you break that down into manageable pieces? What do you need to do today? What can be done later this week? What doesn't have to be done for 6 months from now? So let's just get done what you need to do today, and then when you're exhausted, take a week off, and then come back to that. So helping them make it manageable and something they can accomplish. So learning about the safety planning, learning about the resources, and then creating a safe space for them to come and learn that. So again, that elephant, they have to be safe, right? So some of that, the abuser is monitoring. They're looking at their cell phone, they're watching their computer usage, they're seeing their Facebook. Can they come to your house and make some phone calls? Can they use your cell phone to make calls so it's not stored in the call log on their phones? Can you give them time and place to sort of have a conversation that's not being listened to, so that when they get home, they can put on whatever show they need, but in reality, they're consulting the resources that they need to resort. Can you help create safety by establishing a code word? So I'll give you a very subtle example of this. My name is Emily. None of my close friends and family call me Emily. They all call me Em. If a friend called me and said, Emily, I was just wondering how your day was, something is wrong. Nobody else in the world is going to think that's a code word, because why wouldn't somebody call me by my name? But so coming up with some sort of system that someone can signal to you, I need help. So there's lots of little things that we can do, and Jill's going to talk more about safety planning. One thing that can be helpful, documentation. So whether somebody is ready to act now or not ready to act for a long time, just creating a record and a pattern of what happened can make the critical difference between effective intervention and we know something's going on, but we can't really act on it, we can't really prove it. And this happens partly because our memories, just over time, we begin to forget things, or our memory changes things so that an incident is described very differently several months, several weeks, several years after it's taken place. So having a very specific log, as well as it creates a pattern. Oftentimes one thing happens and it doesn't really feel like a big deal, but when that same thing is happening over and over, now you can establish that it's stalking. Now that you can establish sort of that cycle of violence, now you can establish sort of whatever it is that you might be needing to. So in a sample incident log, you're going to put the date and time that it happened. You're going to describe exactly what happened in as much precise and objective detail as you can. So an example of that would not be, man, they just went ballistic at dinner. It would be during dinner they called her a fat pig, and then they, slammed down the glass and broke the, glass on the table. So the specific details that are objective. The location, the impact, they were scared, they were embarrassed, they cut their hand on the broken glass, they couldn't go to work the next day, so that we understand sort of the whole context of this. Anybody who was there, witnesses, if the victim doesn't want to come forward, maybe somebody else says, yeah, I was there and I saw that this is what happened. If police are involved, writing down yes or no, what the report number was, who they spoke with, what that person's badge number was, again, so that they have a record in any of the number of ways that this may become helpful. If you have evidence, if you have text, take a screenshot of it, print it out so that somebody can't later go in and delete it. If you are taking a photograph, take a photograph of the whole, so let's say I have a bruise on my shoulder, don't just take a picture of the shoulder because that could be anybody's shoulder. So first you take a picture of the whole face. This is the face and the shoulder that the bruise is on. Here's the bruise. So, and documenting that. And you don't need to do anything with it. If someone is saying, you can take the picture, but I don't want you to call the police, you don't necessarily have to call the police right then. Okay, but when you're ready and when you feel safe, we'll have this, because by the time you do feel ready, maybe that went away. So those are sort of different ways that you can be helpful in that process, and I will turn it over to Jill for more. Hello? Go ahead and go to the next one here. So I'm going to talk about just all of these, just a little bit about each of these different areas. There is a safety plan in the back, a handout that goes more in depth on each of the areas. But as you can see by just looking at how many areas of someone's life that it affects, it's a big deal for someone to leave and keep themselves safe and have to consider all of the different areas that an abuser can find someone, and all of the different things that have to be changed. So you have to a good safety plan has to look at a bunch of areas. And then I'm just going to go next to the escape kit. So one of the first things someone can start to do when they're thinking about leaving is to plan to get a escape kit or box or backpack. They can keep it in a hidden place or with a friend that they trust or a neighbor or something like that. And so these are, just some of the things that somebody might want to think of to keep in their kit. Social security cards, bank records, car titles. One of the big ones is an address book, because say the abuser breaks the phone or takes the phone, throws it out the window, nobody memorizes telephone numbers anymore. So to have a backup address book where you have all of the phone numbers of your important contacts to reach out to is a big one. Extra set of car keys, cash, clothes, blankets for the kids, kids' toys to soothe the kids if they have to leave really quick. And so now it's evidence of the abuse, like the log, to always keep that with you, copies of the restraining order. And I'm going to go back just to this now and talk about a little bit of the areas. So in the home, once if the person has been forced to move,
you would want to change the logs. There's organizations like Victims of Crime that can, if a police report has been made, that the person can get restitution to help like install a surveillance system or for relocation, money up to $2,000 to help somebody relocate. And to, like if the abuser has broken something, it may be able to be restored, something like that, that's come directly from the abuse. One of the programs I'd like for people to know about is the Safe at Home program. So say the person, the victim survivor is able to move, there's a state program called Safe at Home, and they can get a confidential address. So it's located in Sacramento, and if the person gets to the new safe address, they can then register with Safe at Home, and they can still vote and give that all of their important information to Safe at Home, and it routes through Safe at Home so that their abuser can't find them through their address. And let's see, also from the home, just really practicing a safety plan with the kids, like Emily was talking about with the code word, have the children have a code word in case the abuser comes somewhere when they're not supposed to. You know, teach the children to call 911, those kinds of things. And so let's see, what else do I have here? Keeping the log that Emily talked about with neighbors and friends, not, you know, letting people know that what's going on. So abuse does thrive in secrecy. So, you know, I know as much as people are, you know, maybe taught as they're growing up to keep things in the family private and not tell people, that's just kind of assists the situation and doesn't help the situation. And Emily talked about the code word with the neighbors. And let's see, so, schools. So whether it's your child's school or the adult's school, you know, letting security know, letting them, always keeping a copy of the restraining order so that you can show either whether it's the child's school or your school, that you could have a picture of the abuser to show the security, and the neighbors too, to alert neighbors or people at your work about the safety issues, and, you know, informing the school of who's allowed to pick the child up, those kinds of things. Having someone walk with you to the car so that you aren't walking alone, and changing your route so that you're not doing a predictable thing. And then changing all of like where you bank, where you, the normal restaurants you go to, the nail salon, you know, a lot of things where, anywhere where the abuser could find you. And so it's just a huge amount of planning to make it safe and to take it really serious. And I wanted to say about employers. So there's a law now that if you let your employer know, if the employer has more than 25 employees, they are the employee who is experiencing domestic violence can let the employer know that this is happening, and the employer has to work with them. Can't fire them for the, you know, say the abuser showing up at their work and stalking them. The information for that is at Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center, and if you want more specifics on that, but it's really good because the victim survivor can get medical attention, take time off of work to get medical attention, to safety plan, to get shelter, to get counseling, and so that's like a really nice step that that has been taken. So now I want to talk a little bit about what to expect if somebody does go to a shelter. And so, so shelters, there's some of the hotlines up there, and Haven Hills shelter takes victims of intimate partner violence only. So as Captain Vernon was talking about, where there's family violence, unfortunately, Haven Hills doesn't, and a lot of the other shelters don't take family violence victims. So that's something that we still need more of, is where those people experiencing violence from, a adult child or something like that. We do need more resources for that. So most shelters will have a danger zone, so that if it's happening, within 10 miles, you won't be able to go to the nearest shelter, and some people don't realize that. So we would be, say, referring to a shelter outside because it's too easy for the abuser to find them in the nearest shelter. So, but all of the shelters in Los Angeles area are in touch with each other every day through what they call a space check, so that they can know who has space as of that morning. So they will know, yes, we have space for a single family, we have space for, or a small family, or a single person, a large family. So that is something really nice. I always like to prepare people that it takes a lot of phone calls. You can't just decide, oh, I'm going to go to a shelter, I'm going to call, and I'm going to get into a shelter. And so people will get frustrated sometimes for the amount of calls they have to make to get shelter. But also, the shelters are usually, the crisis shelters are usually like 30, 45 days. And so there is a rotation. So you just, tell them that just to plan to keep calling and to not give up. And let's see. The shelter location has to be confidential. It does, Haven Hills, not all of them, but Haven Hills does have a school on site, so a K through 12 school, so that the children can be safe and the abuser can't find them at their school, and they're required to leave school. People are mostly required to leave work unless they could be transferred. It's like, say they work at a place that has a franchise and they can go to another location that the abuser wouldn't know. But that's pretty rare. Mostly they would be asked to not work. And then one of the big things now is that people have to give up their cell phones because it's too tempting in a weak moment for them to maybe reach out to the abuser, and that would jeopardize, the staff and the other people at the shelter. So, but that is one of the things that I think they find the most distressing in this day and age where everyone is so attached to their cell phone. So I think that's pretty much it, and I think I'll just give it back to Emily to wrap up. Yeah.
Q&A, you ready?
Yeah, sure.
I want to make one other comment. Is I talked a little bit about, or alluded to, the dangerousness of guns, because most domestic violence victims are, when they're killed, are generally killed with a gun. Every restraining order has a gun restriction on it, whether it's an emergency protective order that the police can issue at the scene, that's good for 5 to 7 days. A civil restraining order, a criminal protective order that's issued by the criminal court, a restraining order that's issued in dependency court and children's court, all of them have the same rules. You cannot own, obtain, or possess a firearm. Many of those restrictions last for 10 years. And we know it's the major cause of homicides. So I know that it's a big step and it's a hard step to take, but there's a protection that goes along with it that you don't think of when you're getting that order. You're just thinking of getting the order to, I need the phone calls to stop. I need to be able to take my kid to school in safety. But that gun prohibition is crucial, and it really helps law enforcement because unfortunately there's a lot of domestic violence among gang members as well, and sometimes they can't use some of the gun restriction, the gang restrictions, but there may be a domestic violence restraining order out there, and they can take the gun away that way. So it's got sort of unusual uses that come in very handy for public safety. So I just wanted to be sure that we talked about that as well.
You're referring to the restraining order against the individual,
against
not
the abuser,
owning the firearm.
not owning, possessing, or obtaining a firearm, including bullets.
While he's restricted.
So even if they previously had a legally possessed firearm,
Yes.
they lose that privilege?
They become what's
once
considered a prohibited possessor, and we periodically get notifications of people who fall into that category. We actually go out to their homes, and it's not a legal demand, but we can ask for them to cooperate and give up that gun. A judge, when they do it, will ask, and we usually will run and see if people have a show of possession, like a registered firearm in their name and so on. Then we know that they have one that they shouldn't have. But they can also simply transfer that gun to another person temporarily, and then they meet the criteria. But there's one other provision, though, in addition to what Gail mentioned. When the police go to a home and there's domestic violence alleged to have happened, one of the things we teach the officers to do is to say, are there any weapons in the home? And if the wife says, yes, he owns a gun, would you like us to take it? And if she says yes, we can take that without a warrant. And it's taken under a civil possession, not a criminal thing, not under a search warrant or anything. And we hold on to it temporarily. And then it's reviewed later through the detectives and through the courts whether we will give that gun back. But the owner of the gun will have to petition to get it back. It won't be destroyed. But it will be taken at least temporarily, just under the heat of the situation. Now, sometimes the wife can say, well, I don't want you to take it. Or, no, there's no guns. But if they say, yes, I know he's got one, it's around here somewhere, well, would you like us to look for it? Or would you like to help us look? Yes, then they can do that as well.
What about the victim getting a concealed carry permit for her protection?
That's a different issue, and that's a difficult thing in California to get. They can certainly go after it, but they have to go to a police chief or a sheriff to obtain it.
And one of the things you also have to realize is that that abuser, if there's any hesitation, is going to grab that gun, and it's going to be used against that victim. That's been our experience. But since we're here with the city council person, there's a huge homeless initiative that's going on in the city and county of Los Angeles, and domestic violence shelters. And I'm not a shelter, so I'm not plugging my own agency's funding. Domestic violence shelters and transitional housing are an incredible model to put people back on in their own homes and productive and educated and able to be stable and productive in their communities. They have lost so much of that funding, a lot of it through, especially for the transitional shelters, through restrictions that have been put on by the federal government. There is a chance in the way the homeless initiative is currently structured for domestic violence to have a voice in how that money is used. That is a functioning model that has been proven over and over and over again to work. And I have yet to hear somebody say, we should be talking to the shelters about how the program works. I just wanted to say that. And there's also a piece of legislation in Sacramento about removing bail. Domestic violence is a recidivist crime. That means that those abusers abuse over and over and over again. They do not want their power taken away from them, which is what a restraining order does, which is what shelters do, what happens when that victim starts to leave. That's why the danger is so high when they leave, because the abuser becomes desperate and obsessed with that victim. Not having to have an exception to that bail, those few days are the few days where we can often have an advocate talk to them, do that DV education that Emily and Jill were talking about, so that they can make informed decisions. That bail is crucial. It's crucial for the safety of domestic violence victims. And I know about inequality. I know about how poor people are affected. But if it saves a victim's life, I am willing to have that carved out for the safety of our community. That's my plug.
It's a good plug, and I appreciate it. So thank you, and let's give them all a big round of applause. Great presentations, really good, useful information. But let's also move to see if there's any questions, comments that anybody in the audience wants to make. Ma'am.
We've addressed overlapping issues, and this overlaps with violence and the Me Too issue that's come up. I really think shared bathrooms with men and women in stores and schools are a mistake and high risk. That's my opinion. And speaking as a woman, someone with a brother and 3 nephews, and who was the caregiver for my dad, you guys in your bathrooms and ladies in their powder rooms are different by definition and habit. And if we share them, y'all need to sit down and put down the seat.
Appreciate the comments.
Okay.
Thank you. Sir.
How many of the LAP divisions have a DART?
They all have them.
They all have.
They all have them. They function. That we're supposed to look pretty much the same. With they're different, by their provider. I mean, I'm very prejudiced because I carved out this program and I carved it out with LAPD and the city attorney's office and the DA's office, and we think our way is a very functional model. It's a difficult model. It's a hard model. Because I think the expertise of the advocates has to be really high, but it works.
So each DART has a separate.
And that provider is supposed to be going out with the specific DART officer to the scene.
Thank you, ma'am, and then sir.
I'm going to kind of plug my program really quick.
Good.
Kind of.
In fact, when you speak, why don't you stand up so everybody can hear?
I'm going to piggyback off her. My name is Linda. I'm with the City Attorney Victim Assistance Program, and I'm a victims advocate. And there is now, I think, at every police station, one of us there. So we get copies of the police reports. So DART will go out, and afterwards we get copies of the police report, and we'll contact the victims next day or whenever we see the report, and let them know the services that are available. If they need shelters, we help them to get there and apply for reimbursement for relocation, or we make sure that we're being in contact with the victim. And there's one at almost every police station now, LAPD station, obviously not in LA. And we actually have an app now, so if you do know someone that needs help, you can go on Victim Assistance Program, and it'll go to the nearest advocate at that police station. So if you're at Topanga Division, you can go online or the app, put it in, and someone will contact you within 24 to 48 hours. So that's another way we're all.
It is a fabulous program.
What's the app so people know how to download?
It's Victim Assistance Program. Just VAP, Victim Assistance Program.
Great. Sir, in the back.
I'd just like to,
If you could stand up so people can hear you.
Hello, everyone. I'd just like to know what are some of the specifics of the shelter, the domestic violence shelters. What are the accommodations like? I know you said you can accommodate small family or individual. Does a small family get their own room? Or does it depend on the shelter? Or you can describe a little bit.
Sure.
Good question.
I'm not sure this is working. Oh yeah, it is. Okay. A lot of them are communal living shelters. Haven Hills does have individual apartments, but just to give you a scope, there's 6 units, individual apartments for and that's not very many. So that's for the crisis shelter, but they can accommodate, like one apartment can accommodate up to like a family of 10. Like say it's if it happens to be a mother with 10 or 9 children, so they have bunk beds and things like that. So they can accommodate large families. And then the transitional shelter has 16 units. So, and they are also their own apartments.
So when you say communal, that means they share restrooms, showers, or?
In some of the shelters, yeah. I would say the majority of them, I would say.
Most of the shelters that I've worked in, to the extent that they have a communal living, they try as much as possible to give each single person or family their own bedroom, and then there might be shared bathrooms or a shared kitchen or shared communal areas. But understanding that we're balancing trying to keep as many people safe as possible with these are people going through trauma whether it's the trauma of the actual violence or picking up everything and moving. So they want to give people as much sort of space as possible. The other thing also, and we've sort of used a language a lot tonight about sort of the perpetrators being he and the victim being she and husband and wife, the shelters look different, and some accommodate males and some are very accommodating of the transgender community. Some are not. Some say they are on paper but have some work to do in terms of sensitivity. So doing your research and finding out, and I think it's important to balance safety on a number of levels and knowing where you're going to go. And someone, even though they're scared and even though they're feeling desperate, has the right to ask, what quality of services am I going to get when I get there?
One last question, if I may. Which body regulates and licenses domestic violence shelters? Is there someone that, or some agency that takes a look and makes sure they're up to code? They have to make sure they have a Prop 64 warning saying.
Probably there's so much paperwork to jump.
Well, because we're funded by different grants, I mean, so I feel like those are I don't know, we like adhere to what the grants, so the California Emergency Services is one of our grants. The CalWorks, Department of Social Services, provides assistance. So I feel like we're accountable to the funders. And then there's the Housing Commission Investment.
And I'm sure that they have to fall under regulations of similar types of public housing or commercial housing, like if you were renting a room or an apartment and so on. There's going to have to be, those kinds of regulations that go beyond just private residential. So it'll be similar.
Building and safety in the cities.
Yes.
I mean, renting a regular room.
They are audited up the kazoo.
Right.
I mean, seriously. I mean, if you have a city or a state or a federal grant, you have to prove that you have met all of these criteria, and they physically come out and inspect the site, and they've got all your statistics, and they can also call you randomly, and they believe me, they are watched very, very closely.
Some of this is an emergency transitional type of safety housing. I imagine standards would be slightly different than if I was to rent a two-bedroom apartment and I had 6 months to go look for one. So I can understand the standards.
No, because of the safety issues, the monitoring is closer, not less. They're much more closely watched. It's also because it's public money.
I guess the measuring stick is what I'm asking about. What standard do they use to measure if they're up to par? I understand that they're being closely watched, but what standard are they using to measure if this one facility is good enough? But I think I've asked plenty of questions.
Okay, ma'am in the yellow.
I think someone just mentioned that we discussed primarily that women are the victims, but men and fathers are the victims. And I wonder if you have a recommendation for me about a father who is seeking assistance, particularly full custody, because don't the judges and the courts favor the mothers in custody?
In my experience in the courtroom, whoever has power in the relationship has power in the courtroom. There's a lot of people will say women have the advantage because they're seen as more nurturing or they're seen as more caring. People will say men have the advantage because they have more money, they can hire better attorneys. It really depends on the dynamic
So
of
that
the
could
case.
be a myth? That could be a myth?
It
So
depends on the case.
if a father goes in with documentation, I take him to school, I take him to the doctor, the mother's MIA, the mother's the perpetrator, they've got a fair shot in court?
The laws are different in domestic violence cases by state law. There's a specific statutes that deal with domestic violence, and the standards are very different. Rather than, because it's a long discussion, but the standard are frequent and continuous access to both parents in divorces and separations when kids are involved. In domestic violence, it's the health, welfare, and safety of the child, and that's what the judge has to look at.
Is there a specific resource for men and fathers?
There are tons, actually.
Yeah, I've seen many advertised where there are lawyers that represent fathers, in particular in custody cases.
Oh, wonderful. Could someone help me with the reference?
So
I'm sure that somebody here, I would Google it, and I'm sure that you'd come up with the state board, or, you know, of the attorneys or what have you, that people advertise like that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Haven Hills, my card is back on the table back there. If they're looking for support groups, you know, we do accept men in the support groups and at the shelter. So, and we can, if they call, you know, me, I'll talk to them about that kind of stuff. They can call the crisis line, and they may be, if they need shelter, may be eligible for the shelter because they do accept men.
So there's resources up there that people sort of jot down, take a cell phone picture of. One thing I would argue, or just sort of caution against, is knowing the credibility of your sources, especially when there's a lot of sort of anti-domestic violence victim work that's being done under the guise of father's rights. And so I think if you're Googling specifically father's custody, you have to be very careful that someone's not going to A, do sort of damage to a family in general, or B, sort of prey on somebody in a vulnerable situation and use them as a cause for something
Have an
else.
agenda.
Right, because that person deserves, you know, sort of the integrity of their case. But I also want to broaden that in general. Domestic violence through law enforcement, through shelter, through the court process, there's so many intricate pieces that add up to the final picture that it's really problematic when we say, well, your case sounds like what my friend went through, your case sounds like what I went through, so let me tell you what to do.
Right.
Because you may not understand the thing that makes it different. And so when you set somebody's expectation of here's what can happen or here's what can't happen, we really can give someone false hope and set them up for something dangerous. We can diminish hope for something that could potentially be very beneficial. So I just encourage people, take advantage of the experts around. If you're not an attorney, don't give legal advice. Say, here's a little bit about what, and again, I've been in and out of courtrooms for 20 years. I know a lot of legal language. I should not be giving legal advice because I haven't gone to law school and I don't know the technicalities of certain things. So what I want to say is, here's what I think may be appropriate. Here's some questions to ask. Here's attorney services, or here's legal advisors that can give you that. So here's what I know a little bit about shelter. I went to this great, you know, speaker presentation at the, you know, last night. They had some fabulous phone numbers. Let's call one of them together from my house so that you have the privacy to talk to and really connect with the experts who can sort of walk through those kinds of issues.
We're running against our time. Does any last burning questions? Okay, ma'am.
Once they go into the shelter, how long can they stay?
So at the crisis shelter, it's been traditionally 30 days. They're extending it a little more, closer to 45 days now, and that's Haven Hills. Different shelters are different. And then the transitional shelter. Oh, and to get into a transitional shelter, you almost always have to go through a crisis shelter. You can't just go straight into a transitional. And the transitional right now is 18 months, and that may start to change a little bit and be in shorter increments, but right now it's 18 months. And some are up to 2 years. I think that's the longest that I've heard is 2 years.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you to Haven Hills because in 1998, and it gave me the courage to leave after a 22-year.
Wow. I think there are lots of those stories out there, and it always feels good to hear the other end of it.
Thank you for sharing that. So before we end, I want to just make a few announcements, mention a few folks who are here, and then the panelists and others will stick around for a little while if anybody wants individual questions. So just to mention a few folks who are here as well, Kylie Joaquin is here, right there. He's here tonight from LAPD's Clergy Council. This council is currently sponsoring a series of discussions on the truth about domestic violence. If you're interested in attending any of those future events, I'm sure he'd be glad to discuss it with you afterwards. Maggie Espada Hernandez is here. Maggie, back over there. She works with the Center for Assault and Treatment Services, or CATS, which provides services to adults and children who've been assaulted. The center provides counseling to survivors of assault and helps to collect forensic evidence after an assault has taken place. And finally, Linda Hernandez is here. Linda, right there. She already mentioned she works with the City Attorney's Victim Assistance Program, which provides support and funding to crime victims in partnership with the police department. So they're here as well as our panelists for conversation afterwards. And I always have to do a few plugs whenever we're doing for upcoming events. This Saturday, if you're interested in doing a bike ride, I'm doing my annual Bloomingfield bike ride where we go at a family-friendly pace. And we have LAPD with us to go on a continuous ride. It starts at 9 a.m. on Saturday, March 3rd. Every we feature a different part of the district. This year we're starting in Warner Center Ranch off Khalifa with their flyers in the back. There's also a St. Patrick's Day Community March on March 17th. There's some information about it back there. And so with that, thank everyone and I also want to mention my great staff that's here, especially Veronica, who really worked hard to put this together, and the rest of my team, Wave, that are here. They all helped make this together. And I apologize again for the beginning. We had a little mix-up where some of us were waiting outside for a few minutes because the door wasn't open. So I'm sorry about that, but I'm really grateful that all of you came, and I'm really grateful for the panelists who gave such great presentations and great questions and answers. Let's give them all a big hand, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.